are required to report to their designated quarantine. Riots have continued for a third consecutive day, and winter rations are at an all-time...
Curfews and isolating people from others to prevent them getting sick. Now, is this an effective way of keeping populations safe? And it's kind of the opposite of maybe a TB hospital. It's the other way around. We're trying to keep the healthy people in and the sick people out, rather than the sick people in and the healthy people out.
Certainly in terms of, throughout history, there's been lots of isolation, right back to the 1600s when ships would come to Europe bringing cargo. They would have to go through health authorities and be checked for plague and for other infectious diseases. And, even right through to kind of, the Ebola outbreak in the last few years, isolating infected people, is a way of managing a situation like that. So, there's certainly room for elements of that in kind of the management of situations like this. In terms of something as dramatic as that, when you start looking at kind of imposing quarantine zones and putting people into areas and, just imposing rules and like forcing people into situations, that's when it's obviously going to get a lot more kind of ethically challenging.
I think it's weird to describe it as a quarantine zone. I know they do in the game, but it seems more the equivalent of in the olden days when you built a wall around the town to try and keep sort of marauding outsiders out. But there's a sense in which, they can see it isn't fully effective because it's an infectious disease, and it, whether the spores can move across, or we get a sense there that the disease can survive in sort of damp housing, which I thought raised an interesting issue, which you get in a lot with infectious diseases. Often people who are poorest, who live in the worst housing, who are most affected. There's a sense in which you see sort of health inequalities and social inequalities show through in the structure of who gets infected and by what.
So inequality and poverty. But let's think about rationing as well. Maybe there's no food here. Obviously, presumably there's difficulty with infrastructure for getting food to people. How do we find that in? Let's use the word quarantine. A quarantine zone is getting people what they need and the help they require. So how would that go about, do you think?
I think it would be very difficult because, a lot of that is going to be informed by surveillance. And depending on what societal infrastructure is available to you, there may be some degree or no degree of surveillance. So it's not very clear as to how you would be able to detect kind of, if there was a pocket of people with a particular illness or whether it was spreading very quickly. And obviously there's lots of things to consider, like how virulent the disease is and how quickly it spreads. Does it spread from person to person? Is it direct contact? Do you have to, does someone need to sneeze on you, or is it in the air? Can it be, suspended in the air? So I think, there's lots of things to consider in terms of finding out more about the disease and finding out more about its spread and its transmission before you're able to really adequately kind of allocate a response plan to that, if there's even any infrastructure to be able to do that, really. So I think a lot of it is about kind of that surveillance element and finding out the information and managing with the resources that you do have.
I mean, how would we cope then? How would the government cope if we had to lock everything down? Is there plans in place for that? Is that sort of thing, does it exist?
Well, I guess we did it for the Second World War, but maybe the world has changed so much since then that that maybe the underlying sense of solidarity that people had, or that was generated by the Second World War, which enabled the rationing to carry on afterwards. People, some grumbling, but sort of seeing that was something fair. I'm not quite sure whether what would happen if there was a big disaster and somebody tried to institute rationing, and you could imagine the successor of Cameron saying we're all in this together, and nobody really quite believing anymore. And so to have any sort of system of rationing, it depends on a really strong social solidarity, the idea that despite the fact that nobody has enough, that somehow people see that it's fair and people aren't gaming the system.
You come through here?
Half hour ago. He went back to the wharf. He's there now.